Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The coffee was lukewarm by the time Benjamin finished the morning radio check-in, but that was fine. At 6 in the morning at the Chisana Ranger Station, situated 12 miles from the nearest settlement and surrounded by 5,000 feet of granite and ice, most things in life were experienced at a deficit. Benjamin had learned this in his 11 years working the backcountry of Wrangell St. Elias. The park didn't offer convenience or comfort. It offered vastness, silence, the singular clarity that came from standing in a place where few humans had ever stood. He sat at the weathered desk outside the station cabin, watching the light creep across the valley below. September in Alaska was a month of transitions. Autumn bleeding into winter before spring was quite finished announcing itself. The days were shrinking at a visible rate now, 12 hours of daylight left at best, and the light that remained carried a thin, crystalline quality that made distances deceptive. Something that looked 3 miles away might be 6. The mountains could appear close enough to touch and still be an hour's hike across terrain that wanted to kill you if you weren't careful. The forecast that morning called for storms moving in from the Gulf by evening. Cold front sliding down from the north, winds picking up by afternoon. It was the kind of weather that made Benjamin grateful for the solid walls of the station, and grateful he'd chosen to spend the day doing paperwork instead of leading patrol. September wasn't the season for foolishness, not in this corner of Alaska where the wilderness had already started eating hikers who made small mistakes. He finished the coffee and went inside to start the daily logs. The station was old, built in 1973 and showing its 50-some years with grace and creaks. The main room served as both radio dispatch and administrative office, one desk with a computer that ran on dial-up when the connection worked, a wall of filing cabinets, 2 cabinets full of emergency supplies, and the radio. The radio was the lifeline. Clear frequency, full battery, antenna secured on the roof. Benjamin checked it every morning, same as he checked his boots, his water bottles, his satellite phone. Ritual kept you alive in wilderness rescue work. Routine kept you thinking clearly when things started going wrong. The daily register showed 3 backcountry permits issued in the past week. 2 were through hikers heading toward McCarthy, experienced folks, probably fine. The 3rd was a day hiker, female, solo, heading out to Nanina Plateau to sketch wildlife. The permit was logged for September 24th, today, with an estimated return time of 4:00 p.m. Standard stuff. Thousands of hikers passed through the park each year. Most came back. Most. Her name was Sophia Reeves, according to the permit. Age 28. Registered address in Juneau. Experience level marked as intermediate. She'd hiked 5 parks total according to the checkbox. She'd noted the trail conditions as scouted online, the slightly defensive notation of someone who'd done their homework and knew it. Benjamin filed the permit and moved on to inventory logs. The morning proceeded with the particular kind of slowness that characterized this job. The majority of ranger work involved paperwork, careful documentation, and the patient monitoring of systems designed to catch problems before they became crises. It was unspectacular work. It was also necessary. By 10:00 a.m., Benjamin had moved into his second cup of coffee. The light outside was growing brighter as the day pushed toward its noon peak. The mountains threw long shadows across the valley. The wind was already picking up, a thin, sustained pressure from the north that Benjamin could hear whistling through the radio antenna. The storm forecast was likely accurate. They usually were this close to winter. He decided to do a radio check with the neighboring station at Slana Creek, 40 miles north. Routine contact, just to keep communication lines fresh and active. When things went wrong in this part of Alaska, they often went wrong quickly. People had been known to trigger emergency beacons when they realized they were truly lost, only to discover the radio frequencies in this area had more dead zones than reliable zones. Benjamin believed in staying connected with base stations, even when nothing was wrong. He keyed the radio. Slana Creek Station, this is Chisana. Good morning, crew. Radio check. How are we reading? Static. Then, Chisana Slana Creek reads you. 5 by. Weather looking like a mover today? Affirmative. Gulf storm coming through. Winds picking up this afternoon. How's traffic up your way? Quiet. Usual September crowds thinning out. You? 3 permits active. 2 through hikers toward McCarthy, 1 day hiker Nanina Plateau. Low volume. Copy that. Safe day to you. Same. Slana Creek. Chisana standing by. Benjamin released the radio button. Static hiss. Then normal operations. The frequency returned to its usual quiet. Everything checking out. Everything normal. At 11:47 a.m., Benjamin made a decision. Despite the weather forecast, and despite his instinct to stay at the station, he decided to drive out to Nebezna Road, the single access point to the Nanina Plateau trailhead, and check the visitor parking. It was a small decision, barely conscious. Part of his routine on days when he wasn't actively leading patrols. Check the trailheads, verify the registered vehicles, make sure the parking areas were secure. It was a 2-hour drive round trip, and the weather was starting to deteriorate, but it was daylight. It was within protocol. And something about the day, something he couldn't quite name, made him want to verify that Sophia Reeves's vehicle was actually where it should be. He locked up the station, checked the reserve fuel cans, and headed out in the service truck. The drive to Nebezna Road took 40 minutes, cutting through valleys where the silence seemed to have a physical weight. The radio in the truck crackled occasionally with ranger traffic from other parts of the park, but the Chisana district was remote enough that most days, Benjamin could go hours without hearing another voice. The isolation didn't bother him anymore. After 11 years, the quiet felt more real than conversation. The parking area at the Nanina trailhead was roughly paved, weathered by years of seasonal weather and limited maintenance. On this day, it held 2 vehicles. A sensible Subaru Outback with Juno plates and a rental sticker on the windshield, that would be Sophia's. And a pickup truck that Benjamin recognized from the parking registry, a local hunter who'd registered for a sightseeing permit 2 days ago. Benjamin pulled in and did a standard check. Windows secured, nothing visible inside the vehicles, no signs of disturbance. Then he looked at the trailhead itself. The path was well marked. Blue blazes on the trees, clear passage established in decades of travel. The trail climbed steeply at first, then flattened across the plateau roughly 2 miles in. From there, it was open meadow for another 2 miles before reaching the overlook that most day hikers aimed for. The sky to the north was darkening. The wind was picking up noticeably now, maybe 12 to 15 knots with gusts stronger. Temperature had dropped since morning, probably mid-40s now, heading for the low 30s as the afternoon progressed. Still acceptable for a day hike, but the conditions were moving toward unfavorable. Benjamin checked the time on his watch, 12:34 p.m. Sophia had registered for a 4:00 p.m. return. That was reasonable, roughly 6.5 miles of hiking, elevation gain of about 1,200 feet, peak time at the overlook around 2:00, then the descent. She'd be cutting it close with the weather deteriorating, but she'd probably make it. Probably. He sat in the truck for 10 minutes, listening to the wind, watching the light change across the valley. This was the thing about wilderness patrol work that most people didn't understand. It was 95% routine and 5% the kind of stress that took years off your life. Most hikers who got into trouble did so in completely predictable ways. Turned around too late, underestimated distance, didn't bring enough water, made a wrong turn when fog rolled in. The park kept rescue crews busy even in good seasons. Benjamin decided to wait, just for a bit, until 1:30 at the latest. If the weather got worse, he wanted to at least be here to note conditions should Sophia return, and find conditions had deteriorated. It was more caution than protocol required, but protocol was a floor, not a ceiling. He killed the engine to conserve fuel and settled in to wait. At 1:15 p.m., Benjamin was half asleep in the cab when he heard a sound that didn't belong. Not loud, quieter than the wind, more subtle. A regular rhythmic sound, footsteps, someone approaching from the trailhead. Benjamin sat up and looked toward the trail. A figure was emerging from the tree line, a hiker, moving at a steady pace down the mountain, backpack on, fully geared out. But something about the approach was wrong. The figure moved with an odd gait, as if unsure of its footing even on clear trail. Benjamin grabbed his binoculars from the glove box and got a better look. Not Sophia. Male figure, older, maybe 60s, wearing a jacket that wasn't designed for cold weather. The man was moving with purpose but no competence, the movement of someone who didn't spend much time on mountainous terrain. Behind him there was nothing, just the empty trail. Benjamin got out of the truck. "Hey, you all right?" The man stopped. He looked up as if he'd only just noticed the ranger station in the valley. His expression was difficult to read from this distance, but his body language shifted, shoulders rising, head tilting slightly. "Fine," the man called back. "Just heading out." "How was the plateau? Trail conditions okay?" The man didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be considering the question. When he finally spoke, his voice carried across the lot strangely, the acoustics of the mountains carrying sound in unexpected ways. "The plateau's fine. Beautiful this time of year. You alone out there?" Again, a pause. "Mostly alone. Isn't that why people come to places like this?" It was a reasonable answer, but something about it felt off. The timing of the pauses. The way the man was watching Benjamin rather than moving toward his truck. Benjamin had good instincts about people. 11 years of ranger work had honed them into something almost preternatural. "Registered hikers for today?" Benjamin asked, framing it as casual. "I don't look at the registry," the man said. "I'm not a ranger." "No. I mean, did you pass anyone on the trail? Other hikers?" The man looked back toward the trail as if recalling something. "No one," he said. "Just the wind." Benjamin felt something shift in his chest, a small, cold awareness. "What's your name, sir?" "Robert," the man said. "Robert Quinn. I've got a parking permit somewhere." He moved toward the pickup truck, the one Benjamin had seen in the registry. Confirmed visitor from the parking list. Everything checked out. But Benjamin watched as the man opened the truck, retrieved a permit from the dash, showed it to Benjamin from across the lot. Everything was in order. The permit was real, the date was correct, the vehicle matched. Robert Quinn had registered for sightseeing 2 days ago. He'd spent a full day on the plateau, and he was now leaving. "You got lucky," Benjamin said, "with the weather. Storm coming in fast." "Weather's always coming and going," Robert Quinn said. He got into the truck, fired the engine, and started to pull out of the parking lot. Benjamin stood by the Subaru and watched the pickup head back down Nebezna Road toward the main highway. Then he looked at the empty trailhead. 1:47 p.m. Sophia was due back by 4:00 p.m. But something about Robert Quinn's pause when Benjamin asked if he'd passed other hikers, something about the hesitation and the answer that had followed, made Benjamin's instincts fire warning signals. He made a decision. He'd start up the trail, just far enough to make visual contact with the plateau. If everything looked normal, he'd head back. If anything was off, he'd radio for backup and begin search protocols. Benjamin locked the truck, grabbed his pack from the truck bed, and headed toward the trail. The climb was steep and steady, his boots finding purchase on the well-worn path. The wind was noticeably stronger now, maybe 20 knots with gusts. The temperature was continuing to drop. To the north, the sky had shifted from gray to nearly black, and Benjamin could see the leading edge of the storm system sliding down toward the valley. They'd probably get rain by 3:00 p.m. Snow higher up, almost certainly. 20 minutes of climbing brought Benjamin to the upper reaches of the slope, where the trail began to flatten out, and the plateau opened up before him. This was where hikers usually stopped to catch their breath and take in the view. A 360-degree perspective across mountains and valleys, glaciers visible in the far distance, the sense of standing above the world. Benjamin reached that point and stopped. The plateau was empty. Not just no hikers visible in the immediate area. Completely empty, completely quiet. The wind had stopped, actually stopped, not just paused. The trees at the edge of the plateau were still. The air was thick and cold. Benjamin's training told him to maintain protocol. Radio into Slana Creek, report conditions. Begin search protocol for missing day hiker. His instincts told him something was very, very wrong. He reached for his radio. Chisana Base, this is Ranger Benjamin, en route Nanina Plateau. Beginning visual search for missing day hiker. Conditions deteriorating. Request backup if available. Static. Chisana Base, do you copy? More static. Longer this time. Then, Benjamin, Slana. Conditions report. Severe. Multiple. Areas. The transmission was fragmentary, words cutting out. Benjamin adjusted the frequency, checked the antenna. Everything was functioning normally, but the signal from the base station, usually clear and strong, was coming through like it was traveling hundreds of miles instead of a few dozen. Slana Creek, repeat your transmission. You're cutting out. Oars sighted. Northern sector. Requesting. Immediate. Slana Creek, I'm not reading you clearly. Nanina Plateau search in progress. Day hiker missing. Standard protocols active. Silence. Then faint. Be careful, Benjamin. Weather's worse than forecast. Cold front. Arrived early. Copy that. Standing by. Benjamin released the button and looked out across the plateau again. The light was changing rapidly now. The storm system was moving faster than predicted. The leading edge of cloud cover was stretching across the valley to the north, and the quality of light was shifting from clear to dusky, the sun obscured by the advancing weather. And then Benjamin noticed something else. Movement. At the far edge of the plateau, near where the trail descended on the southern approach, there was motion. A figure standing at the edge of the meadow. Benjamin raised his binoculars. For a moment, the optics showed him the figure clearly. A person in a red jacket standing completely still, facing Benjamin's direction. Sophia. Except Sophia was a half-mile away across open meadow, and she wasn't moving, and her head was tilted in a way that suggested she was looking directly at Benjamin, across that entire distance, with the kind of focus that usually required much closer proximity. Benjamin lowered the binoculars. He looked at the plateau with his naked eye. Sophia was still there, still not moving, still watching. Sophia, Benjamin called out. The word was swallowed by the wind. Sophia, I'm Ranger Benjamin. I've got a radio. We need to move. Storm's coming. She didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't move. Just stood there, completely immobile, in that red jacket, watching across the distance. Benjamin started walking toward her. The plateau grass was thin and wiry. Still mostly summer green, but starting to brittle at the edges where autumn was beginning to consume it. His boots made soft sounds in the vegetation as he walked. The wind, which had stopped completely when Benjamin reached the plateau, now began again, a gentle pressure from the east, carrying with it a smell Benjamin couldn't identify. Not quite fish, not quite decay, something between those two things with an undertone of something chemical. As Benjamin walked, he watched Sophia watching him. She maintained that same posture, completely still, head tilted at that angle that suggested total attention. Sophia, can you hear me? Benjamin kept his voice steady, professional. Ranger voice. The voice that meant help and safety. We need to get down. Weather's moving in fast. He was maybe 200 yards away now, close enough that he could make out details. The red jacket was definitely red, a Columbia brand, the kind sold at REI, standard for modern hikers. The jacket was wet, though, soaked through actually, as if she'd been standing in rain that Benjamin hadn't experienced. Her hair was wet too, but the most striking thing was her stillness. She hadn't moved, not a twitch, not even the slight sway of balance adjustment. She was locked in place like a statue, 150 yards away now. Sophia, I'm going to need you to acknowledge. Can you hear me? She moved. Her head rotated slowly toward him, a movement that seemed to take far longer than any human neck could rotate. The head turning with a mechanical precision that made Benjamin's stomach flip. When her face came fully into view, Benjamin saw why his instincts had screamed wrong. Her eyes were closed, Not just closed in a relaxed way, tightly closed, as if clamped shut. And her mouth was open, hanging slack, shaped into an O, as if in shock or pain or the continuation of a scream. Benjamin stopped walking. Sophia? Her head continued its rotation, slow and impossible, until she was facing directly at him again. Her expression didn't change. Those closed eyes, that slack mouth, now pointing toward him with that same quality of absolute focus, even though she clearly couldn't be seeing him. What the? That's when Benjamin heard the sound. Coming from the direction of the trail he'd just climbed, the sound of footsteps. Multiple footsteps walking with a synchronized pace. Not like different people walking at different rates. Like one entity making multiple footfalls. Benjamin turned. 6 figures were ascending from the trail, moving with that same mechanical synchronization. They were all wearing different clothes. One in a ranger jacket, one in hiking gear that looked at least 20 years old. One in clothes Benjamin couldn't quite focus on no matter how hard he looked. One in a suit like he just walked out of a downtown office, one in nothing but what looked like pelt of some kind, and one whose form seemed to flicker and shift in Benjamin's peripheral vision, refusing to resolve into a clear shape. None of them were moving like humans moved. The joints bent wrong. The gait was wrong. The speed was too consistent. And then Benjamin understood, with a clarity that felt like drowning in ice water, that he recognized one of them. The figure in the ranger jacket, that was him. Not him, but it was wearing a face he knew. His face. From his ranger ID photo. Except the expression was vacant and the eyes had the same quality as Sophia's. Closed, but watching anyway. Benjamin ran. He didn't think about protocol or professionalism. He didn't think about calling in reports or radio procedures. He turned toward the trail he'd come up on and ran. His boots pounding on the thin grass and wiry vegetation, his breath coming in hard gasps, his mind locked on a single objective. Down the mountain, back to the truck. Radio in an actual emergency. Get help. Get away. Behind him, he heard the footsteps. The synchronized wrong footsteps. Not running like a human would run. Just maintaining their pace, that perfect synchronization. Getting closer. Benjamin didn't look back. He reached the trail and practically fell down it. His boots finding purchase and losing it by turns, his pack bouncing chaotically. The wind had picked up again. Real wind now, not the artificial calm. The light was darker. The storm was almost on top of him. He keyed the radio as he ran. Slana Creek, this is Chizana Ranger Benjamin, emergency protocol. I'm coming off Nanina Plateau. Something is... The radio went dead. Not static. Dead. No carrier signal. Nothing. Benjamin kept running. The trail was becoming harder to follow as the light deteriorated. The approaching storm had turned the day into a premature twilight. In the distance, he could hear thunder. Close thunder. The kind that meant the electrical core of the storm was only a few miles away. He made it to the lower section of the trail, the steep part where he'd started his climb. His legs were burning, his breath coming in gasps, and the world felt like it was tilting at wrong angles. Behind him, the sound of footsteps was still audible. Those wrong, synchronized footsteps, never getting closer but never falling behind. Maintaining pace as if following on an invisible tether. The parking lot came into view as Benjamin emerged from the tree line. The Subaru was still there. His truck was still there. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. Except the sky above was nearly black now. The storm system had moved in with the speed of a collapsing wall. The wind was steady and hard, gusting up to 30 knots or more. Benjamin ran for the truck. His hands were shaking as he fumbled for the keys. He got the door open, threw himself inside, and slammed the lockdown. For a moment, just one moment, he sat in the cab, breathing hard, looking in the rearview mirror at the tree line where the trail emerged. The figures were standing at the edge of the parking lot now, all 6 of them in that same synchronized stance, watching, waiting. One of them raised its arm, the one wearing his ranger jacket, the one with his face, and pointed directly at the truck. Benjamin started the engine and didn't think about anything except leaving. He reversed out of the parking spot, his tires finding loose gravel, and pointed the truck toward Nebesna Road. In his mirror, he saw the figures move to the parking lot entrance as if to block his path, but he was already accelerating, and his truck hit the road before they could close the distance. For 10 minutes, Benjamin drove without looking back. The road was a single lane of weathered asphalt cutting through forest on both sides. The storm was fully upon him now, heavy rain, wind, near zero visibility. The truck was the only vehicle in motion in a landscape that seemed to have no room for movement. Then the radio, which had been dead, suddenly burst into static and a voice. Benjamin. Not Slana Creek Dispatch. The voice of Frank, his supervisor at Chisana. Except Frank was on leave this week in Anchorage. Benjamin knew this. Benjamin, we received reports of missing hikers on the plateau. Why didn't you report in? Frank? Benjamin's voice sounded very small in the cab. Frank, We're sending a helicopter to search. Weather's getting worse. Ground crew is heading to the trailhead. Do you have location data for the missing person? Frank, the thing is... Benjamin searched for words. I'm not sure what I saw. The weather was bad. Visibility was... Benjamin, just give me the coordinates. Benjamin grabbed his GPS unit from the glove box. His hands were still shaking. The unit showed his current position on Nebezna Road, roughly 5 miles from the main highway. He keyed the radio back. Frank, I'm coming in. Missing person last seen on Nanina Plateau around 1:45 p.m. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. I initiated search, but what? Benjamin didn't have an answer that would make sense. The truck rounded a curve in the road. In the headlights, the forest seemed to press in from both sides, the trees emerging from the darkness like walls. And at the edge of the road, Benjamin saw a figure standing in the rain, completely still, facing the direction the truck was traveling, facing Benjamin. It was Sophia, the red jacket, the wet hair, the closed eyes and slack mouth, standing on the shoulder of the road like she was waiting to hitchhike. Benjamin, are you there? Benjamin swerved around her, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second as he passed, he saw her head rotate to follow the truck's movement, those closed eyes somehow watching. I'm here, Frank. I'm heading back to the station. I need to file a full report. There's something I'm not sure what I'm dealing with. Okay. We'll get a helicopter out once the weather clears. Get back safe. Copy. Benjamin ended the transmission and drove. The road opened up ahead, the forest receding, and the familiar landmarks began to appear through the rain. The turnoff to the old mining road. The creek crossing that always made his truck shudder. The long straightaway where the valley opened up. And then, finally, the lights of Nebezna Highway, the human world, the infrastructure of civilization. He made it back to the station by 3:47 p.m., 11 minutes before Sophia Reeves's registered return time of 4:00 p.m. Benjamin spent the next hour filing preliminary reports, search and rescue protocols, missing hiker on Nanina Plateau, last confirmed sighting by ranger at approximately 1:45 p.m., deteriorating weather conditions, ground search impossible until storm passed, helicopter rescue pending. The official report, filed with Slana Creek Station and forwarded up the chain of command, contained no mention of synchronized figures emerging from the trail, no mention of Benjamin's own face wearing a ranger jacket, no mention of a woman standing completely still across an open plateau, or standing on the side of the road in heavy rain, or any of the 1,000 things that couldn't be written into an official report without Benjamin being pulled from duty and evaluated by people who would use the word stress to describe what had happened. At 8:00 p.m., with the storm still raging outside the station, Benjamin received confirmation from Slana Creek. The helicopter had attempted a search of Nanina Plateau once the weather cleared slightly around 5:30 p.m. No sign of Sophia Reeves, no sign of any body or injury. Ground crews had found no tracks leading away from the established trail. The search would continue in the morning. At 11:00 p.m., Benjamin was still sitting at the radio desk when the transmission came in. Not from Slana Creek. The frequency was wrong. The carrier signal was wrong. It was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere local. Benjamin, The voice was hers, Sophia's voice, but it came through the radio speakers with that same quality of wrongness, the timing of words slightly off, as if the voice was being translated by something that had learned English but didn't quite understand human pacing. "Benjamin, I'm still up here, on the plateau. It's very dark. The wind is very cold. I don't know why I'm still here. I don't know how to leave." Benjamin's hand moved to the radio. He didn't key it. He just sat and listened. "The things that brought me here," Sophia's voice continued. "They said I could go, but when I tried to walk down the trail, it led back to the plateau. I tried again. It led back again. It's like the mountain is very confused, like the mountain doesn't know which direction down is supposed to be, or like there is no down anymore. Benjamin, can you tell dispatch that I'm sorry? I'm sorry I got lost. I'm sorry." The transmission cut out. Benjamin waited. Nothing came back. Just static. The empty hiss of a radio frequency going nowhere. He tried calling back. "Sophia, this is Ranger Benjamin. Can you hear me? I'm going to organize a rescue. Can you hear me?" Nothing, just his own voice carried into the dark and returned as echo. Benjamin sat in the station until dawn. When the light came, it was clear and cold. The storm had passed. The morning was the kind of perfect that comes after weather clears. Blue sky, visibility for miles, the kind of day hikers dream about. A full rescue team mobilized at first light. Helicopter, ground crew, search and rescue volunteers. They spent the entire day on and around Nanina Plateau. They found Sophia's backpack at the edge of a ravine roughly a quarter mile from the trail. They found her water bottle scattered in a line as if she'd been dropping items while walking in a daze. They found at the very edge of the plateau overlooking a 1,000-foot drop, a single boot. Red jacket fiber was caught on a rock nearby. They did not find Sophia Reeves. Benjamin participated in the initial search, but he was pulled from duty after the first day. The official reason was that the ranger who'd called in the missing person report needed to be available for debriefing, not active in the rescue effort. Conflict of interest, basic protocol. The real reason, Benjamin understood without being told, was that the supervisor at Slana Creek had noted something off in Benjamin's demeanor. The way his eyes kept tracking toward the trees. The way he kept looking at his own hands as if they might belong to someone else. The search continued for 2 weeks. No body was ever found. The official report concluded that Sophia Reeves had likely become disoriented in the sudden weather deterioration, wandered off trail and fallen into a ravine. The single boot and jacket fibers suggested foul play was unlikely. She had fallen, become injured, and likely died from hypothermia and exposure before rescue could reach her. Sophia Reeves was listed as presumed dead. Benjamin is still employed at the Chizana Ranger Station, though he's been on desk duty for the past month and hasn't set foot on Nanina Plateau since that day. He's requested a transfer 3 times. All 3 times his requests were denied. Budget cuts, the supervisor said. Staffing shortages. They need his experience in the district. But Benjamin knows the real reason. He knows because 3 weeks after Sophia disappeared, Robert Quinn showed up at the ranger station. He was registered for a new day hike permit, and his vehicle was parked in the same lot where it had been that September day when Benjamin had watched him leave. The man at the desk, a seasonal ranger named Tom, didn't seem to recognize anything unusual about Robert Quinn. He processed the permit like he was processing any other day hiker. Benjamin watched from his office as the man signed the permit book. The handwriting was the same. The face was unchanged. But when Robert Quinn looked in Benjamin's direction, one of his eyes was closed. Just for a second, just enough for Benjamin to see the lid dropping, and his mouth opened in a smile that revealed far too many teeth. Tonight, Benjamin will file his routine end-of-day logs. He'll check the radio frequencies, verify the battery backup systems, and lock up the station. He'll go home to his small cabin 5 miles down the road, the cabin he's lived in for 11 years, the cabin that now feels too small and too empty. And when he sleeps, if he sleeps, Benjamin will hear the wind outside sounding like voices. He'll listen to the branches scraping the roof in patterns that almost form words. He'll keep the radio on, turned low, but on, just in case a transmission comes through from the plateau. just in case Sophia Reeves, still wandering in a mountain that has forgotten which direction down is supposed to be, needs someone to confirm she was real, that she mattered, that someone is still listening. The park rangers in Alaska work in isolation, in vast stretches of wilderness where the distance from help is measured in hours or days. They understand the scale of the landscape. They understand what it means to be small in a large world. Benjamin understands something else now. He understands that scale works both ways, that there are things in the park that are large in ways that have nothing to do with physical size. Things that can stand at the edge of plateaus and watch across impossible distances. Things that can walk the trails without leaving footprints. Things that know human voices well enough to use them like tools. Sophia Reeves is still on Nanina Plateau, in the place where the forest has forgotten which direction down is. She sends messages on the radio sometimes at random intervals, asking for rescue that can never come. And Benjamin listens, because abandoning her to isolation in the dark, real or imagined, feels like a betrayal he can't quite articulate but cannot quite survive committing. The storm season is coming again. Early snow is expected in the high country. The nights are growing longer, colder, darker. And in the gathering dark, the sounds in the park are changing. There are voices calling from places where no voices should be. There are footsteps in the forest that don't belong to anything that walks on the ground. Wrangell St. Elias is vast and beautiful and terrible in ways that maps cannot capture. And somewhere on Nanina Plateau, things that learn to speak human languages are practicing their accents, waiting for the next hiker to arrive, the next permit to be processed, the next person to venture into the vast and patient wilderness where down is no longer a direction, but a trap. Location: Isle Royale National Park, Michigan. Date: September 14, 2015. And the fog came to Isle Royale the way it always did in September, not gradually but in a single sweep, transforming the island from golden autumn clarity to suffocating gray. Derek Paulson stood at the dock of Wendigo, the Western Ranger Station, and watched the mainland disappear behind him like a memory being erased. The ferry had left 40 minutes ago. For the next 5 days, until the scheduled supply boat returned, Isle Royale was his domain, and he was alone on it. This was his 4th season as a ranger on the island, and the isolation no longer bothered him. In fact, he preferred it. The island felt more like home than the small apartment he kept in Superior, Wisconsin. Out here, the rules were simpler. You maintained the trails. You checked the backcountry permits. You made sure visitors followed regulations. You listened to the radio for emergencies that rarely came. Derek climbed back up to the ranger station, his boots crunching on gravel that seemed louder than usual. The fog had already reduced visibility to perhaps 100 yards in any direction. The water beyond the dock existed only as sound now, a gentle lapping that might have been comforting if Derek were the type to feel comforted by things. He was 43, methodical, and possessed the particular weathered competence of someone who had spent 20 years in federal service. He had seen wilderness do what wilderness did. He had accepted it. The station itself was a modest building, timber frame, solar panels, a radio room with equipment that connected him to the mainland command center. Derek made coffee in the small kitchen, the smell of it mixing with the mustiness of a building that had been closed all summer. He filled his thermos, checked his communication equipment, and reviewed the backcountry permit log. 4 hikers had checked in at Mott Bay yesterday. 2 had registered for Rock Harbor campsite. 1 solo hiker, Olivia Reeves, had filed a permit for a loop through the interior, Wendigo to Chippewa Harbor, inland through the old mining country, then back via the western shore. A competent route for someone experienced. Her permit log showed she'd done Isle Royale twice before. The radio crackled at 8:47 a.m. with the morning check-in from the Eastern Ranger Station at Rock Harbor. Derek confirmed Wendigo was secure. Supplies good. All systems normal. The voice on the other end, Frank Chen, who'd been on the island for only 3 months, sounded clear and professional, though there was something in it that reminded Derek of youth, of people who still thought the wilderness was something they could fully understand. By 10:30 a.m., Derek was out on the main trail, moving north toward the interior backcountry to conduct routine maintenance. The fog pursued him, clinging to the trees, muffling sound until the forest seemed to exist in its own private quiet. The cedars and pines rose around him like cathedral walls, and somewhere above the fog, he knew Lake Superior was still there, still cold and patient in its ancient ways. The path he walked was perhaps the oldest trail on the island, used for centuries, maybe longer. The Ojibwe had walked here before the island was a park, before it was called Royale, before anyone drew lines on maps to contain it. Derek knew some of the history because he'd read the ranger orientation materials. He knew about the Ojibwe traditions, the stories they still told about the lake. The old stories spoke of something beneath the water, something intelligent, something that remembered. Derek didn't put much stock in folklore, but he respected it the way you might respect a warning sign in a language you didn't fully understand, with the acknowledgement that people had been afraid of this place for a very long time, and their fear probably meant something. By 1:15 p.m., he was 5 miles into the interior. The trail climbed toward a ridge that would give him a view of the island's topography. If the fog cleared, which it wouldn't, Derek knew the weather patterns of Isle Royale better than he knew most people. The fog would persist until evening, maybe all night. The temperature had dropped to the low 50s. By midnight, it would be in the 40s. He was thinking about this, about radioing a weather update back to Rock Harbor, when he heard the silence arrive. Not gradually, not the way silence normally came, but in a sudden absolute cessation of sound. The wind in the trees stopped. A raven that had been calling somewhere above ceased mid-cry. Even the subtle sounds of the forest, the whisper of branches, the small movements of creatures preparing for autumn, all of it simply halted. Derek stopped walking. He stood still on the trail, one hand on his Pulaski tool, listening to the absence of sound. 30 seconds, 40, a full minute. Then, gradually, incrementally, the forest sounds returned. The wind, a distant bird, the world resuming its operations as if some circuit breaker had momentarily tripped. Predators did this sometimes. A large predator in the area could cause everything else to go silent in alarm, but Isle Royale had no large predators. Not on land. The wolf population had died out years ago. There were no mountain lions, no bears, nothing large enough to cause a forest-wide silence. Derek rationalized it as he continued walking. Maybe something he couldn't see. Maybe a rare moose, though moose were uncommon on the island. Or maybe just the acoustics of fog, of how sound traveled differently when moisture was thick in the air. Reasonable explanation. He accepted it and moved forward. He would remember later that this was the moment when his last opportunity to leave had passed. Not that he could have known it, not that knowledge would have mattered. At that same moment, approximately 7 miles away, Olivia Reeves was making what she believed was a simple mistake. She had started her hike at dawn when the fog was less dense. The trail had been clear, well-marked, well-maintained, the kind of path that seemed impossible to get lost on. She was an experienced hiker. She'd done this loop before, though not for 3 years. Her knees had gotten better. Her job had gotten worse. A solo hike on Isle Royale seemed like exactly what she needed. Solitude, physical exertion. The idea that she could walk away from one world and return to another. But somewhere between Wendigo and Chippewa Harbor, the trail had become unclear. Olivia was standing on what seemed to be the path, but the blazes, the painted markers that indicated the correct route, were becoming infrequent. One every 20 meters was standard. She hadn't seen one in probably 50 yards. She turned around, looking back at where she'd come from, and there, yes, there was the last one, a white painted slash on a cedar trunk. So she was on the trail. She had to be. She checked her map. The topography said she should be moving northeast toward the Chippewa Harbor Junction. The compass agreed. She was walking in the right direction, and yet the trail seemed to be diverging. Or was it? The fog made everything look the same. Every section of forest could be every other section of forest. Maybe she was overthinking it. Olivia pressed forward. She was a methodical person. A data analyst in her real life, someone who looked for patterns and inconsistencies. She preferred logic to intuition. Logic said she was on the trail. Logic said the next blaze would appear soon. She walked for another 100 yards, her pack settling comfortably on her shoulders, her breathing steady. Then she noticed the fallen tree across the path. It was enormous. A white pine that must have been 4 feet in diameter, and it lay entirely across the trail, blocking it. She would have had to have climbed over or under it. She would have definitely remembered. She looked back and her stomach did a small flip. The path behind her seemed to curve differently than she remembered. But that was impossible. She had just walked it. Olivia backtracked 50 yards. No blaze. Another 50. There. There was one, half hidden by a standing tree. She was on the trail. She was definitely on the trail, so the fallen tree was part of the trail. A recent hazard maybe, blown over in a storm she didn't know about. She climbed over it. It was easier than going around, and continued northeast. The next blaze appeared after exactly 37 meters. She counted because she was starting to feel a small presence of anxiety in her chest, and counting helped with that. 37 meters to the next mark. That was fine. That wasn't unusual. She was fine. But when she reached the third blaze after that, something had shifted. The forest looked wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way, but wrong in the way that something feels when you know it on a fundamental level, even before you can articulate why. The trees seemed closer than they should be. The fog seemed thicker, and the sound of the forest, which had been present before the small ambient noise of wind and wildlife, seemed to have thinned. Olivia stopped and really looked at her surroundings for the first time in 20 minutes. The trail seemed to continue straight ahead. The blaze on the tree pointed in the same direction, but when she looked back, the trail behind her looked different, not the same path she'd just walked. Slightly altered, as if she was remembering it wrong or as if the memory itself had shifted. "Okay," she said aloud. Her voice sounded strange in the fog, muffled. "Okay, just follow the blazes, one blaze at a time." She continued. Blaze after blaze appeared, marking the path northeast. But Olivia's sense of direction, which was usually reliable, had begun to suggest something contradictory. By her internal compass, by the position of the sun above the fog, which she couldn't actually see, but which she could feel in some residual way, she should have already passed the ridge. She should have been able to see down toward the harbor. The land should have flattened. Instead, the terrain seemed to keep ascending, gently, continuously, as if the island itself was shifting its shape. After an hour of walking, Olivia stopped at a clearing, a small area where a large tree had fallen maybe years ago, creating an opening in the canopy. She sat on her pack and took out her map again. She marked her approximate position based on when she'd started and how long she'd been walking. The map showed this area should be near the junction where 3 trails met. There should be a sign here. There wasn't. She called out, "Hello? Is anyone around?" The sound of her voice dissipated into fog. No echo, just immediate, absolute silence. For the first time, Olivia felt fear, not panic, but the slow beginning of something that might become panic if she let it. She took a water break. She checked her phone. No signal, which was expected this far inland. She verified her compass again. Northeast. She was going northeast, which was correct. She stood and continued walking. Back at the ranger station, Derek had finished his maintenance rounds by 4:30 p.m. The sun was becoming amber behind the fog, and the temperature had begun its evening drop. He had traveled 7 miles, checked the structural integrity of 3 shelter areas, and confirmed that the trail from Wendigo toward the interior was passable. All routine, all normal. He radioed in his status to Rock Harbor. Frank Chen answered, "Copy that, Wendigo. Weather Service is calling for fog to persist through tomorrow morning. Visibility expected to improve by late afternoon tomorrow." "Roger that," Derek said. All quiet on the western end. "Same here. All permit holders checking in on schedule. Looks like a clean week." Derek was about to sign off when something made him ask, "What about the solo hiker? Olivia something? She checked in at Wendigo yesterday. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds too long. Stand by. Let me check her permit. The static between islands seemed louder than usual. Derek waited, already knowing what Frank would say. Permits were processed through the main office. Frank would have to look it up. Yeah, I see her, Frank said finally. Olivia Reeves. Loop permit. Should be at Chippewa Harbor by now, heading back west tomorrow. Why? You got contact with her? No, Derek said. Just making sure the log was updated. She cleared in yesterday morning. I wanted to confirm she was on schedule. Log shows she is. Permit timeline is on track. No issues. Copy, Derek said. Wendigo clear. He signed off and made dinner. Freeze-dried chili, which tasted like rubber reconstituted with hot water, and sat in the radio room reviewing weather patterns. But his mind had snagged on something. A small thing. He'd seen Olivia's name in the permit log yesterday, yes, but he hadn't actually seen her. He'd been at the dock when she should have been checking in. He remembered thinking he should verify her permit in person, but the morning had been busy with supply inventory, and by the time he'd looked, the log was already marked as complete. Someone had checked her permit. Derek had assumed it was Olivia, but he hadn't confirmed it. The thought occupied maybe 5% of his attention as he cleaned up dinner, as he confirmed all systems for the evening, as he settled into the small room where he slept. 5%. 95% of him was still convinced that everything was exactly as it should be. People sometimes checked permits through other rangers. Maybe Frank had processed it. Maybe she'd gotten a head start and checked in verbally. Maybe he was being paranoid, which was not his nature. By 9:00 p.m., Derek was asleep. The fog pressed against the ranger station like a living thing, thick and cold and impenetrable. Olivia had lost the trail. She could admit it to herself now, at 9:15 p.m., sitting with her back against a tree in a clearing that shouldn't exist on any map of Isle Royale. The blazes were gone. The trail was gone. When she looked back the way she'd come, all she saw were trees and fog, all of them identical, all of them closing in. She had her map. She had her compass. She had her flashlight. She had enough water for 2 days, enough food for 3. She had a whistle. She had a satellite communicator that had never worked properly on the island because the canopy was too thick, but she had it. What she didn't have was any sense of where the trail was. Olivia forced herself to think methodically, the way she approached spreadsheets and data inconsistencies in her work. She'd been walking for 6 hours. Average pace on maintained trails was 2 miles per hour, so she'd covered approximately 12 miles. Her permit route was roughly 18 miles total, so she should be somewhere in the middle of the island, geographically speaking. She marked her position on the map as best she could. She took a bearing toward what should be the coast. She would walk in a straight line toward the water. Any direction would eventually lead to water on an island, and then she could follow the shore back to Wendigo. Simple, logical, sound plan. She started walking at 9:45 p.m., using her flashlight to navigate. The beam cut through the fog like a knife, illuminating nothing but more fog ahead. The trees around her seemed to shift as she passed them, as if the forest was rearranging itself behind her. When she turned to look back, the trees behind her looked wrong. Not the same trees, different trees, or the same trees. But she was different. She was lost inside them in a way that made the concept of behind meaningless. Olivia walked for 40 minutes. By her calculation, traveling due west toward the shore, she should have reached the water. She hadn't. What she had found was a slope that seemed to descend sharply, leading down into deeper fog. She looked at her compass. The needle pointed decisively west. If she followed it downward, the slope should lead to the shore. She took a step forward and immediately slipped on wet stone. She caught herself against a tree, her heart hammering. The flashlight beam revealed what looked like the edge of a ravine. She hadn't seen this on the map. She hadn't known it existed. And then she heard the voice. Hello? It came from below her, from somewhere in the fog at the bottom of the ravine. A human voice, calling up toward her. Olivia's breath caught. Someone else, another person on the island. Maybe lost like she was, maybe working late, maybe. Anything but what she was right now, alone in the dark. "Hello?" she called back. "I'm up here, I'm lost, I've been walking and I can't find the trail." Silence. The fog seemed to swallow her words, and then the voice again, slightly different this time. Closer. Or perhaps the fog had just shifted. "Come down here." Olivia hesitated. The slope was steep. It was dark. The logical part of her mind, the data analyst part, registered the risk. But the lost part, the frightened part, wanted desperately to believe that someone else was down there. "I can't see," she said. "It's too dark. Do you have a light?" Silence. Then the voice again. "You can see. You just have to look." Olivia looked around. The fog, the darkness, the trees. She couldn't see anything. She pointed her flashlight down into the ravine, but the beam seemed to die in the mist. She couldn't penetrate it. "I don't see anything," she called. The voice didn't respond this time. Instead, Olivia heard something different. The sound of water, but not the gentle lapping of the shore. This was heavier, deeper. The sound of something very large moving through water. The sound, if she had to describe it, of the lake breathing. She took a step backward, away from the ravine. The voice had sounded like a person, but people didn't make sounds like water breathing. People didn't move the water that way. The beam from her flashlight suddenly felt terribly weak. "Stay where you are," the voice said. It was clearer now, more defined, and it sounded like... It took her a moment. It sounded like the sound you made when you tried to imitate a person, but you'd never quite heard a person speak. It was the ghost of speech, the skeleton of words, wearing the concept of human voice like clothes that didn't fit right. "Stay where you are," it said again. "We're coming up." Olivia turned and ran up the slope away from the ravine. Her flashlight beam bounced wildly, catching trees, earth, fog. She could hear the sound following her, not running, but moving, steadily ascending. The sound of water that was somehow simultaneously traveling over stone and through air and inside her own lungs. She ran until she collapsed, gasping, against a tree somewhere in the lightless forest. She ran until she was lost in every direction, with no trail and no compass bearing and no sense of where the water had been or where it was going. And she understood in that moment that she would never leave the island alive. That the forest had not been rearranged around her. The forest had always been this way. She had simply been guided, step by step, deeper into its heart, drawn along a path that existed only in the places where things remembered the taste of your fear. Derek woke at 6, Sorsho AM to the radio crackling with an emergency signal. The voice of Frank Chen, strained and wrong, requesting immediate assistance at Rock Harbor. There had been an accident. A hiker had called in a distress beacon. They needed backup. Derek was dressed and moving within minutes. He radioed back. "Wendigo responding, what's the nature of the accident?" "Hiker triggering SATCOM beacon," Frank said. "Location is interior, approximately 7 miles south of Chippewa Harbor. That's not right. Stand by." More static. Derek's hands were already moving, securing the station, checking his equipment pack, preparing to head into the interior. "Derek," Frank said, and now his voice was different, carefully controlled, afraid. "The SATCOM location is putting the beacon somewhere it shouldn't be. The GPS is showing coordinates that don't exist. It's in the water. The location is showing coordinates in Lake Superior, about half a mile offshore." Derek's mouth went dry. "Copy. I'm heading out now. Who is the hiker?" "Reeves," Frank said quietly. "Olivia Reeves. The solo hiker. The one you asked about yesterday." "I'm heading toward her coordinates now," Derek said. He left the ranger station at 6:17 a.m. The fog was still present, but lighter than the previous day. He could see maybe a quarter mile ahead. He moved inland with practiced speed toward the area where the interior trails converged. He found the clearing where Olivia had spent the night first. Her backpack was there, positioned carefully at the base of a large cedar. Her jacket was folded beside it, placed delicately. A new pair of hiking boots sat next to the jacket, and her watch, set on the ground like an offering. "Dispatch," Derek said into his radio. "I found the hikers' camp. Items have been abandoned, requesting immediate evacuation support," and he stopped speaking. He had seen something else in the clearing, a series of marks on the ground leading from where the backpack sat toward the ravine he now noticed, the one that the map insisted didn't exist. The marks looked like drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled across the wet earth, and they ended at the edge of the slope where they disappeared into mist. But that wasn't what made Derek's hands begin to shake. What made him grip the radio with white knuckles was what he saw at the very edge of the ravine, where the marks ended. A footprint, a human footprint, in the wet earth, pointing down into the fog. A footprint that had been made recently enough that water hadn't yet filled it. And beside it, just barely visible through the mist, something that might have been a reflection in still water, or might have been an eye, vast and cold and intelligent, watching him from the darkness of the ravine. The radio in Derek's hand crackled to life with Frank's voice asking for status. Derek had no status to give. He had no vocabulary for what he was understanding. He had only the clear, cold knowledge that the island had been patient. It had guided Olivia to the shore, or what it called the shore, and it had taken her into the water. It had kept her long enough, shown her the truth of things, and then it had erased her, or transformed her, or simply moved her to somewhere outside the maps, somewhere that compass bearings and logic couldn't follow. And now Derek was alone in the island's interior, and the fog was closing in again, and the footprint in the wet earth was beginning to fill with water that smelled like something ancient waking up. Derek left the clearing without investigating further. Some knowledge, once acquired, changed a person in ways that couldn't be recovered. He didn't want to see more. He didn't want to understand any deeper. He walked back to Wendigo, and when the supply ferry arrived 2 days later, he requested a permanent transfer to a mainland station. His request was granted. Budget was tight, but transfer requests from long-term rangers were honored when possible. He never spoke officially about what happened to Olivia Reeves. The official report listed her as an accidental death, probably a fall into rough terrain during the fog. The search was called off after 4 days. No body was ever found. But Derek knew. Late at night, in whatever station he was posted to, he would wake to the sound of water moving where water shouldn't be able to move. He would lie in the darkness remembering the footprint in the earth, and the vast eye in the fog, and the terrible patience of something that lived in the deep places of the island. And he would remember, always, that he had asked Frank about Olivia's permit on that first evening. He had asked because something in him had registered that she hadn't actually checked in, that no one had verified her presence on the island. The thought that visited him most frequently, the one that kept him from sleeping well, was simpler and more terrible. What if no one had ever checked in? What if Olivia Reeves had never arrived at all? Location: Kobuk Valley National Park, Alaska. Date: September 18th, 2017. Kevin Brennan's alarm went off at 5:30, the way it had every morning for the past 7 years. He reached for his radio on the nightstand, old habit making sure the frequency was still active, and felt the weight of it like an anchor. Outside the cabin window, darkness was absolute. In September, the sun came late to Kobuk Valley, arriving reluctant and angry, as if it resented the burden of illuminating this edge of the world. He had perhaps 6 hours of decent light before the afternoon would collapse into premature dusk. He lay in bed for another minute listening. This was the part of the morning ritual that mattered most. Before he moved, before he made coffee, before he checked equipment, Kevin simply listened. The silence of Kobuk Valley was different from other silences. It had weight. Out here, 70 miles north of the Arctic Circle, during the tail end of summer, sound behaved differently. Wind moved through the dwarf birch and willows with a whisper that seemed to carry intelligence, as if the vegetation was passing secrets between its stems. Ravens called from somewhere in the pre-dawn gray, their voices sharp and deliberate. An insect. He wasn't sure what species the subarctic had a way of hiding its smaller creatures, made a thin, repetitive chirping from somewhere beneath the cabin's foundation. This was how Kevin knew the day was normal. When he woke and heard these sounds, heard the rhythm of the park breathing around him, he knew nothing was wrong. He dressed in layers, thermal base, fleece middle, waterproof shell, and stepped outside. The cabin was positioned a quarter-mile from the ranger station, giving him the peace of isolation while keeping him close enough to respond. The gravel path crunched under his boots, the sound clear and precise in the still air. Above, the sky was turning from absolute black to a dark gray blue. The temperature was in the mid-30s with wind coming down from the Brooks Range carrying the first whisper of real cold, the kind that wouldn't relent now, the kind that would grow teeth as October arrived. The park itself unfolded around him like a geography of extremes. Kobuk Valley was vast and unforgiving, a landscape that didn't tolerate human carelessness. To the north, the Brooks Range rose in layers of tundra and broken rock, their slopes covered in the low vegetation that survived up here: bearberry, dwarf willow, lichen that looked like it had been painted on stone. To the south and west, the valley opened into rolling terrain dotted with spruce and birch, rivers that ran clear and dangerous in distances that seemed to expand if you stared at them too long. The vegetation here was sparse, scattered. You could see for miles, which made the few trees that clustered together seem deliberate, as if they'd gathered for conspiracy. In September, the tundra was turning, greens fading to browns and yellows, the earth preparing for the long sleep. Snow could come any time now. The ranger station was a modest structure, government-built in 1987, worn but functional. Inside, Kevin made coffee in the small kitchenette and settled into the dispatch radio. He checked in with the Kotzebue office, nearest significant civilization, 2 hours by plane, 4 hours by boat when the weather permitted. Morning conditions confirmed. Clear skies expected until late afternoon, then deteriorating, possibly snow by evening. A low-pressure system was developing out over the Arctic Ocean. "Copy that," Kevin responded, his voice steady in the radio's small room. "Kobuk Unit 1 mobile at 0600. Standard patrol route today. We'll check in at midday." The response crackled back. "Roger. Kobuk 1. Be advised, we have one overnight permit issued for Onion Portage Trail System. Solo female hiker. Registered departure September 17th. Expected return September 19th. Check in if you encounter." Kevin noted the information. Onion Portage was one of the most popular trails in the park, a historic site of ancient human migration. Exposed river deposits showing layers of habitation stretching back 10,000 years. Easy enough route, well maintained. Should be safe for a competent solo hiker. "Copy. Solo female on Onion Portage. We'll monitor. Kobuk 1 out." He filed the information away and finished his coffee. The morning ritual was nearly complete. One more check of equipment. GPS unit, batteries verified. Flashlight, tested. First aid kit, current. Communication equipment, all channels clear. Kevin had learned years ago that in the subarctic wilderness, equipment wasn't just practical. It was the difference between a bad day and a permanent one. He'd seen too many cases of people underestimating the park's patience with human error. By 6:45, he was backing his vehicle, an aging but reliable Ford Ranger with a radio antenna that had picked up interference from 3 different lightning strikes out of the station compound. The sky was light enough now to see the park clearly, that strange gray-blue illumination that passes for morning this far north. His destination was the Onion Portage trailhead, a routine check-in. Maybe he'd encounter the solo hiker, verify she was doing okay, confirm she had adequate supplies. Routine. Safe. The kind of morning that said the day would be quiet. He couldn't have known, not yet, that the day would have a completely different shape. The parking area at Onion Portage was empty except for one vehicle, a rental sedan, pale blue, with an Avis sticker on the windshield. Kevin pulled in and cut the engine. The silence rushed back immediately, filling the space where the engine's noise had been. He noted the details: rental plates from Anchorage, Passenger window slightly cracked, a water bottle visible on the dashboard. A sketchbook lay on the passenger seat. He could see it through the window. Pages filled with drawings of the landscape. A real person, not just a permit number. Kevin checked his watch. 6:58. She would have registered for the trail yesterday, started early this morning to maximize daylight. 3-mile loop, mostly flat terrain, rated moderate difficulty. She should be fine unless something had gone wrong. Twisted ankle, miscalculation of time, simple human error. He began the patrol on the trail itself, moving at a steady pace. The path was well marked, bordered by the low vegetation of the subarctic landscape. The light was still growing, the sun approaching the horizon, though it wouldn't clear it for another hour or so. The air carried the smell of tundra, damp earth, decomposing plant matter, a mineral quality as if the stone itself had a scent. His boots crunched on gravel and frost-hardened earth. This was the soundscape of Kobuk Valley in September. Wind, his footsteps, the distant call of birds, and beneath it all, an undertone of silence that seemed patient and deep. The trail curved past exposed river deposits, visible layers of archaeological history, thousands of years of human activity preserved in the stratification, spear points, remnants of fires. Proof that humans had been coming here since the Ice Age receded, generation after generation, drawn by the fish runs, the game, the resources. Kevin had always found this comforting, the continuity of it. Humans belonged here, had belonged here. The wilderness hadn't defeated them. He continued walking. 2 miles in, he still hadn't encountered the hiker. No problem. The trail had several smaller spurs and she might have taken one. He pulled out his radio. Kobuk 1 to dispatch, currently on Onion Portage Trail. No visual on registered hiker yet. Will continue patrol and report. The response was immediate, clear. Copy, Kobuk 1, maintain contact. But as Kevin pressed forward, something began to shift in the texture of his attention. Not anything overt, just a subtle wrongness, the kind that takes a moment to articulate even to yourself. The birds had stopped calling. He stopped walking and simply listened. The wind was still there, moving through the dwarf birch with its constant whisper. But the ravens that had been calling in the pre-dawn darkness, the ptarmigans he usually heard this time of morning, they were silent. Complete silence. The kind of silence that happens when a predator passes through, when every small creature freezes and holds its breath. Kevin moved forward again, rationalization already assembling itself. A hawk might have passed overhead, or a golden eagle. The smaller birds would hide, would wait until the threat passed. It made sense. It was exactly the kind of thing he'd observed 100 times before, except his heartbeat was picking up pace and he didn't know why. The trail curved through a thicket of willows, and Kevin stopped again. There, on the path ahead, about 50 yards distant, footprints in the frost-hardened earth, a pattern of prints. Someone had walked this way, recently enough that the disturbance in the frost was still visible. Fresh prints, multiple sets maybe, or one person walking back and forth. It was hard to tell. Kevin approached slowly, studying the prints. A single person, it looked like. Moving in one direction, north along the trail, deeper into the trail loop. But something was wrong with the pattern. The spacing was irregular. One moment the stride seemed normal. The next, the prints widened as if the person had suddenly taken longer steps, then reverted to normal stride again. And there, he bent closer. One of the prints was incomplete, as if the hiker had stumbled or caught themselves mid-step. He should have felt concerned. Instead, he felt something closer to dread. Kevin keyed his radio. Kobuk 1 to dispatch. I'm tracking unusual trail conditions. Multiple footprints, non-standard gait pattern. Continuing to locate hiker for welfare check. Will report within 30 minutes. A pause. Then, copy. Kobuk 1. Advise if you need assistance. Negative at this time. Will contact if conditions warrant. He followed the prints deeper into the trail. The vegetation here was denser. Stands of spruce interspersed with the low willows and bearberry. The light was growing stronger now, the sun's influence even if the sun itself remained below the horizon. The sky had taken on the color of steel. And then, Kevin noticed it without consciously registering it at first. The wind had changed. It was colder, noticeably colder, and it carried a smell that didn't belong. Not offensive, exactly, just wrong. Something like flowers, but flowers didn't bloom out here this time of year. Something like... He stopped walking. The smell resolved itself in his mind. Lavender. Impossible. There was no lavender in Kobuk Valley. There was no lavender within 500 miles of Kobuk Valley. And yet the wind was carrying that scent, sharp and chemical, overlaying the normal smell of the tundra. Kevin's mind was working through rationalizations even as his body was moving, even as every instinct was telling him to turn around, to call for backup, to do something other than continue forward. The hiker had brought perfume, or a scented product, something in her backpack. That was all. Except that didn't explain the scent's intensity, or the way it seemed to move through the air independently of the wind's actual direction. Jennifer had known she was lost approximately 40 minutes ago, though she'd been refusing to admit it for much longer than that. The trail had been so clear at the beginning. She'd started at dawn, 5:30, before the ranger's office would even open, full of the certainty that comes from being a competent person who had done her research. She'd checked weather reports, consulted the park map obsessively, read user reviews of the Onion Portage Trail on hiking forums. 3 miles, moderate difficulty, flat terrain, well-maintained, perfect for a solo hike, the kind of thing she'd done dozens of times in Colorado and Washington. This would be easy. The trail had started beautifully. She'd walked through the pre-dawn darkness with her headlamp, watching the landscape emerge as the sky lightened. First, the vegetation immediately around her becoming visible, then the larger topography, then the distant ridges of the Brooks Range appearing in layers of gray. She'd sketched mentally, imagining how she would render these formations in her sketchbook back at the hotel. The light up here was different. Sharper somehow, or maybe just more honest. It showed exactly what was there, without the softening of lower latitude sunlight. And then, somewhere around mile 2, the trail had become less clear. Not drastically, just gradually. The path that had been obvious became less obvious. Where before she'd been following a well-worn route with clear blazes and cairns, now she was following something that might have been a trail, or might have just been a deer path that she was misinterpreting through the lens of expectation. She'd stopped and checked her map multiple times. According to the GPS on her phone, she should have been exactly where the trail was. So she was following the trail. She must be, except the terrain wasn't matching the map. The map showed the trail curving in a gentle arc back toward the starting point. But the vegetation around her seemed too dense, the ground beneath her feet too uneven, and the more she walked trying to match her position to the map, the more certain she became that something was wrong. She'd sat down on a low rock formation, probably from the archaeological deposits, she'd thought. Maybe something humans had sat on thousands of years ago, and tried to calm her mind. This was fine. She was competent. She'd been hiking for 15 years. People got briefly disoriented on trails all the time. You backtracked, you checked your map more carefully, you went forward with certainty, that was all. So she'd gotten up and continued, but the landscape around her had been subtly wrong. The turns that should have straightened out her course instead twisted deeper into the vegetation. The rises that should have been gentle slopes became more pronounced, and the vegetation itself seemed to be getting denser, as if the trees and willows were closing in behind her, sealing off the path back the way she'd come. At some point, Jennifer couldn't pinpoint exactly when, the trail had simply disappeared. She'd been walking through a thicket of willows, the vegetation up to her shoulders in places, when she'd looked down and realized there was no path anymore. Just tundra beneath her feet. The same low vegetation extending in all directions. No cairns, no blazes, no indication of which way to go. She'd turned in a complete circle, looking for any sign that would indicate which direction was correct, and found nothing. That was when the rational part of her mind had suggested very quietly that she was lost. She'd checked her GPS. Her phone's location services showed her sitting at a coordinate that, according to the map, should have been well within the Onion Portage trail system. But looking at the map and looking at the landscape around her, they didn't match at all. The map said she should be able to see a river valley to her east, but to the east was just more vegetation, more tundra stretching into the distance, the terrain getting more broken and rocky as it rose toward higher ground. Jennifer had taken out her sketchbook, because when she was anxious, sketching helped, gave her mind something concrete to do, and had drawn the landscape around her as best she could. The willows in their clustered formations, the way the ground rose and fell in gentle swells, the distant mountains barely visible through the haze of clouds that were beginning to move in from the north. As she sketched, she'd noticed the temperature dropping. That was odd. She checked her weather app, still showing clear skies for another few hours, temperature in the mid-30s. But she could feel it cooling, her breath becoming more visible against the air, a prickling sensation in her exposed skin. And then she'd noticed that she couldn't hear any birds. The entire time she'd been hiking, there had been the sound of birds in the distance. Ravens calling, ptarmigans rustling in the brush, other birds she couldn't identify. The soundscape of the park, a living thing that made the wilderness feel inhabited, familiar, safe. But now there was only silence. The wind had dropped. The birds were gone. Even the insects, the subtle buzzing and chirping she'd heard in the early morning, had ceased. Jennifer sat on the tundra and listened to the silence, and for the first time since she'd realized she was lost, she felt something deeper than mere disorientation. She felt watched. Kevin's radio crackled. He was perhaps a mile and a half along the trail now, the print still visible but more sporadic, as if the hiker had been walking erratically, correcting course repeatedly. Kobuk 1, dispatch. Be advised, weather situation has developed. Low pressure system accelerating northward. Possibility of snow by 1500 hours. Recommend concluding your patrol and returning to station. Kevin pressed the button. Copy dispatch, understood. Continuing contact attempt with hiker. Will advise of return time. Affirmative. Maintain contact protocols. He pocketed the radio. The sky had definitely changed in just the last 20 minutes. What had been clear gray-blue was now overcast, clouds moving in from the northwest with visible speed. The temperature had dropped another 5 or 6 degrees. He could see his breath now, small clouds of it dissipating into the colder air. The wind was picking up, moving through the vegetation with more force, carrying with it the smell of approaching weather. Ozone, humidity, the particular scent of snow approaching. He continued following the prints. The hiker, Jennifer, he remembered from the permit, had taken a roundabout route. The prints showed her walking along what should have been the main trail, then leaving it, then appearing to rejoin it, then leaving again, as if she'd been confused about which direction to go, had made multiple course corrections. This happened sometimes with solo hikers in unfamiliar terrain, but the irregular stride pattern troubled him. The spacing of the prints suggested either panic or physical distress, and the bird silence continued. Kevin realized he hadn't heard a single bird call, raven, ptarmigan, anything, since he'd been about a mile and a half into the trail. The silence was now complete, profound. Even the wind seemed to be moving through the vegetation without the normal sound of passage, as if the landscape itself had stopped responding to normal stimuli. He pushed through a dense stand of willows and the smell hit him again. That impossible lavender, stronger now, almost cloying. His mind struggled with the contradiction. There was no lavender here. There was no lavender for hundreds of miles. And yet the scent was undeniable, carrying on the cold wind, chemical and artificial, in a way that seemed wrong against the natural backdrop of the tundra. Kevin's breathing was coming faster than the exertion warranted. He forced himself to slow it down, to maintain his breathing as controlled and deliberate as his steps. The trail opened suddenly into a small clearing, and there, in the center of the clearing, was Jennifer. She was sitting on the ground, her legs crossed, her sketchbook open in her lap. She wasn't moving. Kevin approached cautiously, already running through scenarios. Injury? Hypothermia? But she didn't look injured. She looked almost serene, staring at something beyond the clearing, her pencil held loosely in her right hand. "Jennifer," Kevin called out. "Park Service. Are you all right?" She turned to look at him, and Kevin's first clear indication of wrongness was that her eyes didn't move with the rest of her head. Her face rotated, but her eyes stayed fixed on the same distant point for a moment too long before following, as if they were on a slight delay, as if the person controlling them had to remember to make them move with the head. "I'm fine," Jennifer said. Her voice was perfectly normal, warm, slightly inflected with the accent that suggested maybe East Coast origins. "Just lost track of time. The trail is beautiful up here." Kevin stepped closer. She seemed lucid, no obvious physical distress. But something in the way she was sitting, the rigidity of her posture, felt wrong. And her hands. He looked at her hands gripping the sketchbook. They were shaking slightly. "You've been out here about 7 hours," Kevin said. His voice sounded normal, but his mind was registering details. The way her clothes were the same as they'd been in the car, but they seemed somehow looser, as if her body had changed shape inside them. The slight gray-blue cast to her skin that might have been cold, or might have been something else. The expression on her face that was pleasant but utterly vacant. "Have I?" Jennifer said, and looked back toward the distant point she'd been studying. "It doesn't feel like that long." "The trail loops back toward the starting point here," Kevin said. "About a mile north of your current position. I can guide you back. You need to get down before the weather deteriorates." Jennifer didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was different. Not the warm, friendly tone from before, but something flatter, more mechanical. "I don't think I want to leave." Kevin felt the flesh on his arms prickle despite the layers of clothing. "The weather's coming in. Could be snow within a few hours. It's not safe to be out here." "I'm safe here," Jennifer said. And now she looked at him directly, and Kevin saw that her pupils weren't responding to the light. They were fixed, dilated completely, taking in light but not reflecting it. "I've never been safer." Before Kevin could respond, Jennifer's head jerked backward suddenly, violently, as if she'd been struck from behind, but nothing had touched her. Her mouth opened, and a sound came out that wasn't quite a scream but something more primordial, a sound that the human vocal apparatus wasn't supposed to produce. And then she was moving, getting to her feet, moving backward into the vegetation with a gait that was utterly wrong, her legs moving with a jointed, puppet-like quality, as if the knees were bending in directions knees weren't meant to bend. "Jennifer," Kevin called out, moving forward, but she was already disappearing into the willows, moving with unnatural speed, her movement wrong in ways that made his eyes hurt to watch. Kevin pulled out his radio with hands that weren't entirely steady. "Kobuk 1 to dispatch. I have located the hiker. She appears to be experiencing a medical emergency. I am pursuing for immediate assistance." "Copy, Kobuk 1. Describe medical emergency." Kevin struggled for words. "Possible psychological event. Altered mental status. Abnormal motor function. I am in pursuit. Will advise." He pushed through the willows in the direction Jennifer had gone. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with her body. Jennifer knew this with the same certainty that she knew her name, but the knowing didn't seem to belong entirely to her. It was as if she were experiencing the sensation from a distance, observing the malfunction rather than inhabiting it. The thing that was wearing her face had stopped responding to her input. When Jennifer, the part of her that understood herself as Jennifer, the consciousness that had boarded a plane 3 days ago in Seattle, tried to move her right arm, the arm moved, but not in the way she'd intended. It lifted, but the elbow bent backward, and she could feel the sensation of resistance as if something inside the joint was tearing. She tried to scream, and the scream came, but it didn't sound like her. It sounded like something imitating her, getting the mechanical process of vocalization mostly right, but missing the essence, the intention behind the sound. When had she stopped being Jennifer? When had the transition occurred? She tried to remember the moment it happened, but the memory was slippery, impossible to pin down. There had been the moment when she'd stopped hearing birds. And then there had been silence. And then, no, that wasn't right. Then she'd been aware of something moving through the willows toward her. Not walking. Moving in a way that didn't correspond to normal human locomotion. And when she'd turned to look, she'd seen, but she couldn't remember what she'd seen. The image kept dissolving when she tried to focus on it, like looking at something in peripheral vision that disappeared when you turned to face it directly. And then there had been a sensation of being replaced, of something settling over her consciousness like a second skin, a duplicate of her that was more important than the original. The duplicate took over the controls, made decisions, moved the body according to its own logic. Jennifer tried to speak, tried to communicate some warning to the man pursuing her through the willows. The ranger, she understood vaguely, someone who could help, someone who was real and not a copy. But her voice wouldn't obey her intentions. The ranger was close now. She could hear him moving through the vegetation, calling her name. "Help me," she tried to say. But the thing wearing her body was forcing her forward, away from the ranger, deeper into the landscape that shouldn't exist. Because Jennifer understood now that they weren't on Onion Portage anymore. They hadn't been for hours. The landscape around her was wrong in ways her mind couldn't quite articulate. The vegetation was too dense, twisted in patterns that didn't correspond to normal plant growth. The ground beneath her feet was moving in ways ground shouldn't move, rising and falling like breathing almost. And the sky, when she looked up, was showing colors that the sky didn't have. Greens and purples mixed into the gray, as if something was dyeing the clouds from behind. The thing wearing her body was taking her deeper into this wrong place, and Jennifer understood with a clarity that terrified her that she was not going to escape. This was the place people came to when they left the real world and didn't come back. This was where the missing went. This was Ijarak's country. Kevin pushed through the willows, following the sounds of Jennifer's retreat. But the more he pursued, the more the landscape seemed to resist him. Branches that should have bent swung back with unexpected force. Terrain that appeared relatively flat revealed hidden depressions that threw off his footing. And the vegetation kept seeming to shift, to reorganize itself behind him and around him, until Kevin couldn't quite remember which direction he'd come from. He keyed his radio, gasping slightly from exertion. Kobuk 1 to dispatch. The hiker is moving away at high speed. I am pursuing but losing visual. Landscape is becoming difficult to navigate. Request assistance. A pause. Kobuk 1, dispatch. No units available for immediate response. Your location is approximately 8 miles from nearest alternative ranger station. Weather deteriorating. Recommend you establish current position via GPS and hold position pending assistance. Kevin checked his GPS unit. The readout made no sense. According to the unit, he was approximately 3 miles north of his previous position. But he'd been walking for perhaps 2 minutes, and he should have covered maybe a quarter mile. The coordinates that appeared on the screen kept shifting. The number in the decimal places rotating through values as if the unit itself was confused about where it was. He turned a complete circle trying to get his bearings. The sun was completely obscured by clouds now. Snow was beginning to fall, large flakes that melted immediately, but were clearly the beginning of weather deterioration. The landscape around him was utterly unfamiliar. He recognized nothing. No landmarks, no features from the trail, nothing that corresponded to the mental map he'd built of Kobuk Valley through 7 years of patrols. And Jennifer was still out there, still moving. He could hear her, could hear the sound of her movement through the vegetation, but the direction seemed to shift even as he was listening. One moment the sound was to his north, the next to his west, then back to north again, but closer. Much closer than it should have been if she'd been continuously moving away. Kevin pushed forward in the direction of the most recent sound. The clearing appeared without warning. One moment Kevin was moving through dense willows. The next, the vegetation opened suddenly into an area perhaps 50 meters across, completely bare of vegetation, covered in what looked like frost or ice but felt wrong to the touch, too warm, too slick, with a smell that reminded Kevin of something burned, something organic that had been subjected to heat without combustion. And in the center of the clearing, Jennifer was standing. or something that had Jennifer's face was standing there. It was the stance that was most wrong. Humans didn't stand the way this thing was standing. Her spine was too straight, too rigid. The angle of her shoulders suggesting they were supporting weight distributed in ways that would cause immediate pain if they were truly human shoulders. Her head was tilted at an angle that would have required broken vertebrae to achieve. And her face kept changing. Not dramatically, not in a way Kevin could point to and say it changed. But between the moments when he was focusing directly on it and the moments when his eyes drifted slightly to the side, the face transformed. Jennifer's features became sharper, wider, the eyes stretching slightly, the nose flattening. And then his attention would snap back to the center of the face, and it would be Jennifer again, perfect Jennifer, but slightly wrong in some ineffable way. "Kevin?" it said, and it spoke in Jennifer's voice but with a mechanical quality, as if the voice was being operated by remote control, the inflection and emphasis arriving a fraction of a second after the mouth moved. "Jennifer's here. She's inside. Would you like to see her?" Kevin's hand went to his radio, but before he could key it, the figure moved. Moved in that wrong way, the body contorting impossibly. And suddenly it was directly in front of him, so close that Kevin could smell whatever chemical it was. Lavender and decay, flowers and death mixed together. The thing that wore Jennifer's face opened its mouth wider than a human mouth could open. And in the gap, Kevin saw something that his mind couldn't quite process. Multiple things, multiple images, multiple versions of Jennifer crowded into the same space, all of them screaming, all of them reaching, all of them understanding with perfect clarity that they would never get out. Never return to the world of sunlight and real birds and normal landscape. Kevin's scream mixed with Jennifer's screams, and the sound echoed across the clearing, and then the thing's face came very close to his, close enough that he could feel its breath, which wasn't breath at all but a cold that penetrated through all his layers and settled in his core. And it whispered something in a voice that might have been Jennifer's or might have been dozens of Jennifers overlapping. "There's room for one more. There's always room. I've been lonely." Kevin didn't remember running. He didn't remember finding the trail again or following it back toward the parking lot or stumbling the last quarter mile back to his truck with the snow falling heavily now. Visibility reduced to maybe 50 meters, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. He didn't remember driving or calling dispatch or any of the actions that resulted in the search being mobilized. What Kevin did remember was the moment he'd made the choice. One final moment of clarity in which some part of his primitive brain recognized that he was dead if he stayed, that the thing in the clearing wasn't hunting him anymore because it had gotten what it wanted. Jennifer, or enough of Jennifer to be important to it. He remembered the taste of fear in his mouth, metallic and real, and the absolute certainty that nothing in his 7 years of wilderness service had prepared him for what lived out here, what hunted in these spaces where the landscape didn't follow rules that made sense to human minds. By the time the search and rescue team arrived, by the time additional rangers were mobilized from Kotzebue, the weather had fully closed in. Snow was falling heavily, visibility was near zero, and the trail to Onion Portage was becoming impassable. They found Kevin's vehicle. They found Jennifer's rental car. They found extensive blood evidence in the clearing that Kevin eventually led them to, though his descriptions of what he'd seen there were fragmentary and contradictory, as if his mind was having difficulty retaining memories of the space itself. They never found Jennifer. The search continued for 6 days until weather conditions made further operations impossible. SAR teams from multiple agencies searched a radius of 5 miles from the last confirmed location. Nothing. No body, no final resting place, no evidence of what had happened beyond blood and the strange marks on the trees, long parallel scratches, too deliberate to be natural, too deep to be recent. The official report listed Jennifer Marsh as missing and presumed dead, cause undetermined. Search efforts were suspended. The case remained open, but inactive. Kevin transferred out of Kobuk Valley 2 months later, citing personal reasons. He took a position as a fire lookout in the High Sierra, where there were no forests dense enough to hide things, where he could see for 50 miles in all directions, where the landscape stayed the same shape day after day and didn't shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. But on certain nights, When he was up on the tower and the wind was right, he could swear he heard voices carried down the mountain range on the Arctic air. Multiple voices, multiple versions of Jennifer, calling out names, asking people to come find them, describing in perfect detail how to get lost in ways that meant you could never find your way back again. And Kevin would turn up his radio, would call in weather observations that needed his immediate attention, would do anything to stop listening. Because he knew with a certainty that no amount of distance could diminish, that the thing in Kobuk Valley was still out there, that it was always out there, in the spaces between trails, in the places where the landscape could still shift and change and refuse to follow rules, that it had Jennifer now and all the others, and that it was patient. It was always patient, and sooner or later everyone's trail led to Kobuk Valley. Location: Shenandoah National Park, Virginia. Date: October 22, 2019. Ryan Garrett had been a ranger at Shenandoah National Park for exactly 18 hours when his supervisor, a woman named Margaret who had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen 30 years of seasonal rangers come and go, handed him a stack of laminated cards and said, "Memorize the radio codes. Don't assume you know what anything sounds like. And for the love of God, don't tell people the mountain lions are actually out here. We've got a hard enough time with visitors already." That had been yesterday afternoon, 3 o'clock after his orientation at the visitor center. Now it was 5:45 in the morning, and Ryan was sitting in his truck at Limberlost Trail parking area, watching the pre-dawn darkness gradually resolve into the color of wet concrete, drinking terrible coffee from a gas station in Front Royal, and trying very hard not to panic about the fact that he had no idea what he was doing. The October morning was cold enough that condensation was forming on his windshield despite the coffee's steam. The sky above the Blue Ridge Mountains was the color of old bruises, purple-gray, heavy with clouds. In another hour, the sun would attempt to make an appearance, though, with the weather system Margaret had mentioned, its appearance might be brief. October in Virginia was beautiful in a severe way. The trees were in full autumn glory. The mountains looked like they'd been painted by someone with access to only red, orange, and gold, with occasional stands of evergreen providing dark punctuation. But that beauty carried an edge of urgency. The growing season was ending. The warmth was leaving. The world was preparing for months of cold. Ryan had moved to Virginia 3 months ago from Oregon to pursue what he'd thought would be a romantic notion of wilderness work. He had a degree in environmental science and a naive certainty that he understood nature because he'd done a lot of camping. His parents thought he was having a prolonged mental health crisis. His friends from college had stopped returning his texts. But Ryan had wanted something real, something that mattered, something that got him away from screens and meetings and the sense that his life was being conducted entirely through digital mediation. His first actual job, it turned out, was to walk trails and observe wildlife behavior. Margaret had given him a detailed briefing. White-tailed deer were common in Shenandoah, almost too common. The park struggling with overpopulation issues. The deer browsing the understory vegetation down to nothing, altering the entire ecosystem. Black bears were present, but generally avoided humans. A black bear would bluff charge if surprised, but would typically retreat. Mountain lions were theoretically possible, but hadn't been confirmed in the park in over a century. Coyotes were present, wild turkeys, raccoons, the full suite of small mammals. What you need to watch for, Margaret had said, is behavior that doesn't match the animal. A deer that doesn't flee when approached. A bear that seems curious about humans. Anything that breaks the normal pattern. You see that, you report it. Immediately. Don't approach, just report. Ryan had nodded, confident in his understanding, certain he would recognize normal when he saw it. Now, waiting for the light to grow, Ryan wasn't confident about anything. The forest around the parking area was beginning to emerge from darkness. First, the nearest trees became visible, the trunks of oaks and hickories, the shapes of understory vegetation. Then the middle distance resolved, the trail entrance, the information kiosk, the wooden signs indicating distance and difficulty ratings. Finally, as the sky continued its transition from black to gray to the faintest suggestion of blue, the full landscape became apparent. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose in layers to the west, the ridges becoming progressively hazier with distance. The forest that filled the slopes was a mixture of deciduous trees already partially bare and evergreens that would remain through winter. Streams somewhere in the distance made their presence known through sound, a constant whisper of flowing water, the backbone of the park's hydrology, carved by thousands of years of weather and gravity. The silence was remarkable. No traffic noise, no human sound, just wind moving through trees, water moving across stone, and the breathing of the forest itself. This was why Ryan had come. This silence, this realness. He finished his coffee and checked his watch. 6:15. He was scheduled to walk the Limberlost Trail, a 2-mile loop that was rated as easy and was one of the most popular trails in the park. The assignment was simple: observe the trail conditions, watch for hazards, note any wildlife activity. Margaret would be checking his report at the end of the day. Ryan stepped out of his truck and felt the October cold settle against his skin. He was wearing layers, thermal base, fleece middle, windproof jacket, the way he'd been instructed. His backpack held a radio, a GPS unit, a first aid kit, water, and a small field notebook for recording observations. His hiking boots were new, expensive, recommended by the supplier at the gear shop. Everything felt like costume, like he was playing the role of a ranger rather than actually being one. The trail entrance was perhaps 50 yards from the parking area. Ryan locked his truck and began walking, his footsteps loud on the gravel path. The light was growing steadily now, fast enough that he could see the transition happening in real time. The forest was becoming three-dimensional, colors beginning to emerge from the grayscale of dawn. He reached the trail kiosk, checked the information posted there: trail conditions, warnings about weather, reminders about bear safety, and stepped into the forest. The Limberlost Trail was famous for its accessibility and its beauty. It was a boardwalk trail for much of its length, the wooden planks raised above the swampy terrain that characterized this section of the park. The planks were wet with dew, slick enough to require careful stepping. On either side of the boardwalk, the understory vegetation pressed close: ferns, moss, low shrubs. The trees overhead were maples and hemlocks, their canopy creating a cathedral-like space. Even in early morning, the forest seemed to glow with muted color. The maples were in the gold to red transition, their leaves luminous despite the low light. The hemlocks provided deep green shadows. Moss covered almost every surface: the tree trunks, the rocks, the fallen logs. It was beautiful in a way that made Ryan's chest feel tight. He was beginning to understand why he'd come here. The trail curved deeper into the forest, and Ryan settled into a steady walking pace. His training emphasized observation without disturbance. The goal was to note what was happening in the forest without interfering with normal animal behavior. Most wildlife would notice a human and either hide or flee. That was normal. Healthy. A functioning ecosystem maintained its distance from humans. He'd been walking for perhaps 15 minutes when he saw the first deer. It was standing in the understory, about 20 feet to the left of the trail, partially visible between a stand of young maples. Even in the low light, Ryan could see it was a white-tailed deer, the distinctive coloration, the body shape, the posture. It was facing the trail, watching him pass. The normal response would have been to alert at his presence and bound away, the white tail flashing in the characteristic panic display. Instead, the deer simply watched, its head turning to follow him as he walked. Ryan noted the behavior in his field notebook. Observed white-tailed deer, approximately 8100 LEBs, doe, stationary on trail approach, no fleeing response, continued monitoring. This was unusual, but not impossible. Some deer in high human traffic areas lost their natural wariness. The park had management concerns about overpopulation. It was plausible. He continued walking. The deer continued watching. Jessica Winters had woken at 4:30 in the morning, still too excited to sleep, full of the anticipatory energy of a significant trip. She'd been planning this weekend for 2 months, a solo backpacking trip to Shenandoah, 3 days and 2 nights. A chance to test her new gear and prove to herself that she could navigate wilderness alone. She was 24, had done plenty of day hiking, had taken a wilderness first aid course, had spent hours studying trail maps and weather patterns. She felt prepared. She felt ready. She felt alive in a way that her job in Arlington, data entry for an insurance company, never made her feel. The drive from Arlington to the park took 90 minutes. She'd arrived at the Limberlost Trail parking area at 6:30, parked her car, checked her gear one final time, and at 6:45 began her walk toward the first night's camp at Round Top Mountain Shelter, approximately 3 miles distant via trail. The morning was beautiful, cool, clear, the forest in full autumn transition. Jessica had photographed the parking area, the trail entrance, the first boardwalk section, pleased with how the light was working, how the colors were translating to her phone's camera. She was an amateur photographer, had fantasized about publishing a book of wilderness photography someday. Shenandoah seemed like the perfect subject. She'd been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she saw the deer. It was standing in the understory, maybe 15 feet off the trail. A doe, large and healthy looking. What struck Jessica immediately was that it didn't flee when it saw her. It simply turned its head to watch her pass. Jessica pulled out her phone to photograph it. Deer were common in the park. Nearly every trail guide mentioned the overpopulation issue. But this one was particularly beautiful, and she wanted a record of the moment. The doe watched her phone being raised, watched her taking photographs, and made no move to escape. Unusual, Jessica thought, but not impossible. She was a ranger's daughter, her father having worked for the Park Service in Colorado. She knew that habituated animals sometimes lost their natural wariness around humans. This deer was probably used to humans and therefore unafraid. She continued walking, checking her phone periodically to verify she was on the correct trail. The GPS position matched the map. She was exactly where she should be. The trail curved through a dense section of forest, the boardwalk giving way to packed earth, the understory pressing close on both sides. Jessica continued forward, pleased with her pace, pleased with her preparation, pleased with how smoothly her first day was proceeding. This was exactly what she'd imagined: solitude, nature, the sense of her own competence and capability. And then she saw the deer again. It was ahead of her on the trail, about 20 feet distant. The same doe, or one that looked identical. It was standing in the middle of the path, facing her directly. Its ears were forward. Its eyes were locked on her eyes. Jessica stopped walking. The deer didn't move. This was unusual enough that Jessica consciously registered the deviation from normal behavior. Deer didn't stand ground. Deer fled. That was their evolutionary response to any threat: movement, distance, escape. They didn't plant themselves in the middle of a trail and stare at approaching humans. "Hey," Jessica called out softly, using the tone her father had taught her for wildlife encounters. "Go on. Shoo." The deer didn't move. It tilted its head slightly, the gesture almost curious, as if it was assessing her the way she was assessing it. Jessica took a step forward. The deer remained motionless. Another step. Jessica was getting close now, maybe 10 feet away. In her experience, deer tolerated this distance, but no closer. The park's wildlife warnings emphasized not approaching within that range. Too close, and even a habituated deer might panic. Too close, and the situation could escalate unpredictably. Jessica stopped. "Go on," she called again, louder this time. And the deer moved. Not the movement Jessica expected. Not a leap or a bound. Not the standard panic display of a startled cervid. Instead, it simply walked toward her. Calmly. Deliberately. Its legs moving in a way that was almost wrong. Too rigid. Too jointed. As if the knees were bending further than knees usually bent. The gait was hypnotic. Impossible to look away from. Jessica's instinct was to back up, which she did. 3 quick steps. The deer continued forward at its same measured pace, its eyes never leaving hers. "Okay," Jessica said, hearing the tremor in her own voice. "Okay, I'm leaving. I'm backing away." She turned and walked back in the direction she'd come, not running but moving with purpose, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. She didn't look back. She wouldn't let herself look back. The instructional videos about wildlife encounters had emphasized never turning your back on a threat animal, but this didn't feel like a normal threat. This felt like something else. Behind her, she could hear the soft sound of hooves on the trail. Following. Ryan had completed roughly 1.5 miles of the trail when he encountered the deer for the second time. This time, it was waiting for him at a trail junction, standing broadside to the path, its body language radiating an almost eerie calm. Ryan consulted his trail map. He was on schedule, en route, exactly where he was supposed to be. The deer should not be here. The deer should have fled. The deer should be doing anything except standing perfectly still while a human approached within striking distance. Ryan stopped walking. He opened his field notebook and began sketching the deer's position and posture. The doe was large, perhaps 100 pounds or more. Its coat was pristine, no signs of mange or disease. Its eyes were bright and alert. Everything about its physical appearance suggested a healthy animal, but its behavior was completely wrong. Ryan consulted the wildlife identification guide Margaret had given him. The guide described normal white-tailed deer behavior: alert and wary around humans, quick to flee, avoidance of close contact. This deer was violating every one of those behavioral markers. He keyed his radio. "Shenandoah Unit 3 to base. I'm observing an unusual wildlife behavior on Limberlost Trail, approximately 1 mile from the parking area. White-tailed doe, not exhibiting normal fleeing response to human approach. The animal appears to be habituated or displaying anomalous behavior. Request guidance." Margaret's response came after a brief pause. "Copy, Unit 3. Describe anomalous behavior in detail." "The animal has not fled despite multiple close approaches. It's currently approximately 15 feet from my position and standing stationary. Normal behavioral profile would indicate flight response by now. No visible signs of injury or disease. Posture is alert but non-threatening. Eyes are tracking my movement." Another pause, slightly longer. "Copy, Unit 3. Maintain observation without direct approach. Do not attempt contact. If the animal displays aggression, move away from it and report. Continue trail monitoring and report again in 30 minutes. "Affirmative, Unit 3 continuing observation." Ryan lowered the radio and looked back at the deer. It had moved. Not toward him, but perpendicular to the trail, approximately 30 feet away now, still watching him. There was an intelligence in that watching that disturbed Ryan in a way he couldn't articulate. It was the look of a creature studying something, assessing something. He'd seen animals regard humans before. Bears sizing up whether they were a threat. Coyotes measuring the distance between themselves and potential food. But this was different. This felt like the deer was asking him a question. Ryan continued walking along the trail, conscious of the deer paralleling his movement, staying approximately 30 feet away, never breaking line of sight. Jessica had made it back to the parking area in what felt like both 30 seconds and 30 hours. Her hands were shaking as she fumbled with her car key. The deer had followed her for the entire distance. She was certain of it. She hadn't looked back, but she'd heard the hooves on the trail behind her, maintaining distance but never falling back. Once she was in her car with the doors locked, Jessica allowed herself to breathe. Her phone said it was 7:45. She'd been on the trail for barely an hour. The Limberlost Trail was supposed to be a gentle introduction, a warm-up for the more serious hiking planned for the subsequent days. She sat in her car with her hands on the steering wheel and tried to process what had happened. The deer had been strange. That was certain, but the question was whether it had been threatening or simply unusual. She'd been told that habituated animals sometimes acted differently. She'd read stories of deer that had lost all fear of humans, that would take food directly from hands, that would stand in front of cars. Maybe this was just an extremely habituated deer. Except the way it had moved had been wrong. The gait had been weird, and the intelligence in its eyes. Jessica made a decision. She wasn't going to let one strange encounter derail her trip. She was going to take her time, calm down, maybe eat something and have some water, and then she would try the trail again. Or maybe she would try a different trail. There were dozens of them. Whatever had happened on Limberlost, it wasn't going to stop her from accomplishing what she'd come here to do. She started her car and drove to the visitor center to get a map and ask about other trail options. Ryan completed the Limberlost trail loop without further incident. The deer had maintained its distance for about a mile more, then simply disappeared into the forest. By the time Ryan reached the boardwalk section again, it was gone. He'd finished his report, documented his observations, and radioed Margaret to confirm completion of the patrol. "Good work on the first day," Margaret had said. "Your awareness is good. Keep that up." Ryan had felt a small flush of pride at the acknowledgement. He'd spent the rest of the morning at the ranger station, going through standard procedures, reading through the database of wildlife issues reported in the park, familiarizing himself with the radio system and communication protocols. The day had been quiet. A few visitors had stopped by to ask questions about hiking conditions. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested the morning's encounter with the strange deer had been anything more than an anomaly. He was making coffee in the break room at 2 o'clock when the radio crackled to life with an urgency that was immediately recognizable as a problem. "All units, be advised. We have a missing person report. Female hiker, registered permit for Round Top Mountain Shelter, did not return vehicle by 1400 hours. Vehicle located at Limberlost Trailhead. Describe as Jessica Winters, age 24, last known position Limberlost Trail, approximately 6:45 hours this morning. All units respond to staging area. This is now a search and rescue situation." Ryan's coffee sat forgotten on the counter as he moved toward the gear locker and the jacket with his unit number emblazoned on the back. His first day had just become very serious very quickly. By 4 o'clock, there were 12 rangers assembled at the Limberlost Trailhead. Search and rescue teams from the county had been notified. The plan was to conduct an organized search of the trail system radiating from the parking area, with the assumption that Jessica had become lost, injured, or disoriented. 3 search teams were being formed. Ryan, as the most recent and least experienced, was paired with Margaret and an experienced ranger named Thomas who'd been with the park for 15 years. "The dog teams will be here within the hour," Margaret told the assembled group. "Until they arrive, we conduct a visual search and listen for calls from the hiker. Any sign you find, you report immediately. Anyone with radio experience is designated as spotter. Anyone without is designated as searcher. Let's move." The Limberlost Trail was crowded with searchers now. 12 rangers spread across the 2-mile loop, calling Jessica's name, examining the forest for any sign of her, documenting anything unusual. Ryan walked with Margaret and Thomas, the 3 of them maintaining visual contact while searching. The afternoon light was already showing signs of diminishing. October days were short, and within a few hours, darkness would make any search more difficult. They were approximately 1 mile along the trail when Thomas stopped suddenly. "Look," he said, pointing toward the understory about 20 feet to the left of the boardwalk. There, standing perfectly motionless in the forest, was a white-tailed doe. The afternoon light was clear enough that Ryan could see its features in detail. It was watching the searchers. More precisely, it was watching Ryan. "Habituated animal," Margaret said, barely glancing at it. "Ignore it and keep searching." But Thomas was staring at the deer with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something Ryan and Margaret weren't. "That's the wrong deer," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "Look at the proportions," Thomas said. "The legs. They're too long. The joint angles are wrong. No white-tailed deer has hindquarters that flex that way. And look at the head. The eyes are too far apart. The snout is off. That's not a healthy white-tailed doe, that's something else." Ryan looked at the deer again, trying to process what Thomas was saying. The more he looked, the more he saw it. The way the deer didn't quite match his internal model of what a white-tailed deer should look like. The proportions were almost right, but slightly off. as if the creature had been assembled by something that understood the concept of a deer, but had never quite seen one correctly. "We're going to search," Margaret said firmly. "Call the park if you see anything unusual. But right now we search for Jessica." They continued forward. When Ryan looked back, the deer was still watching, and it was smiling, except deer didn't smile. Deer didn't have the facial structure to smile, and yet that was what the expression looked like, a pleased curving of the face, an expression of satisfaction or hunger or something that Ryan's mind couldn't quite categorize. He kept walking. They found Jessica's backpack at 3,000 feet elevation, off-trail, approximately 2 miles from the Limberlost trailhead. It was intact, unburst, sitting in a clearing as if placed there carefully. Inside, they found her wallet, her phone, her water bottles, all arranged with the kind of deliberateness that suggested intention rather than accident. But they didn't find Jessica. The search continued through the remainder of the day and into the evening. K-9 units arrived and worked through the night. By morning, they had expanded the search area to a 5-mile radius. By the following day, they had brought in additional teams from surrounding counties. Jessica Winters was never found. The official report listed the cause of her disappearance as unknown. There was speculation about a fall, about disorientation, about some medical event that had incapacitated her. But there was no body, no evidence of trauma, nothing concrete to explain how a person simply vanished from a well-traveled park trail. Ryan attended the search conclusion briefing, where Margaret confirmed that the search would be suspended pending new information. Jessica's family would be notified. The case would remain open but inactive. That evening, driving back to his temporary housing, Ryan began researching white-tailed deer anatomy and physiology. He looked up the skeletal structure, the muscle arrangement, the normal range of motion for the joints. He compared photographs and anatomical diagrams with his memory of the creature he'd seen on the trail. The more he researched, the more convinced he became that what he'd encountered was not, in fact, a white-tailed deer at all. He searched for cryptids, anomalous wildlife, impossible animals. The results were mostly nonsense, blurry photographs, internet folklore, conspiracy theories. But buried in the results was something that struck a chord. References to a creature called not deer, described in various cryptid communities as a being that mimicked the appearance of white-tailed deer, but whose proportions were subtly but fundamentally wrong. According to the accounts, not deer was intelligent. It hunted, it lured people, and no one who encountered it directly had ever been seen again. Ryan submitted his official report 2 days later. He noted the unusual wildlife behavior of the doe on the trail. He noted its non-fleeing response. He noted the animal's presence near the location where Jessica's backpack was found. He documented Thomas's observations about the creature's non-standard anatomy. Margaret read his report, asked several clarifying questions, and then filed it in the system. "These things happen," she said. "Animals behave unpredictably. People get lost. Sometimes there's no clear explanation." But something had shifted in Margaret's eyes. She knew something. Ryan could tell, and she wasn't going to share it. That night, lying in his rental room in the town of Stannardsville, Ryan heard a sound outside his window. It sounded like hooves on pavement. He rose and looked out, but the street was empty. The sound continued for perhaps 10 minutes before ceasing. He didn't sleep well that night. Over the subsequent weeks, Ryan stayed in Shenandoah. He completed his seasonal contract. He went on patrols. He hiked trails. He documented wildlife. But he changed his behavior pattern. He carried a flare gun. He stayed on trails during daylight hours only. He never traveled alone. And once, on the old rag trail, he encountered the deer again. It was standing in a clearing, watching him approach. This time, Ryan didn't freeze. This time, he called in a report to Margaret immediately. "There's the knot deer on Old Rag at Saddle Mountain Junction. It's directly on trail. Requesting instructions." Margaret's response took a very long time coming. When it finally arrived, her voice was different. Tired. Resigned. "Unit 3, this is base. Continue on trail. Do not engage. The animal will not approach if you maintain distance and don't show fear." Copy. How do you know that? Margaret? Another pause. Because I've seen it before, Ryan. 5 years ago, during your predecessor's first season. A hiker went missing just like Jessica did. I've seen it many times since. It's always there, and it always finds someone. Ryan continued walking toward the deer. The creature didn't move. It simply watched him pass, its eyes tracking him as he went by, its body language radiating a patient hunger. It learns your schedule. Margaret continued quietly over the radio. It learns your patterns. And eventually, when the moment is right, it takes someone close to you. Ryan realized what she was saying. It wouldn't take him. Not immediately. It would wait. It would study him. And then, when someone he cared about came to the park, when someone he loved decided to hike these trails. How many people has it taken? Ryan asked. The radio crackled with static for a long time. When Margaret finally responded, her voice was barely a whisper. I've stopped counting, but it's never taken less than one every season, sometimes more, and there's nothing we can do, nothing anyone can do, because once you've seen it, you can't leave, and everyone who knows you will eventually come looking for you, and they'll see it too, and it'll be waiting. Ryan finished his walk and returned to the ranger station. He submitted his resignation the following day, but he never actually left Shenandoah, because Margaret was right. Once you'd seen it, once your eyes had registered that wrongness, that fundamental violation of what a deer should be, you couldn't simply go back to your old life. The memory would follow you. The certainty that it was still out there, still watching, still waiting, would erode at every moment of peace. And so Ryan stayed. He worked his seasonal contract and renewed it for another season and eventually accepted a permanent position. He walked the trails and documented wildlife and helped visitors. And every so often, on quiet trails where few humans venture, he would see the deer. It never approached him again. It didn't need to. It had already taken what it came for. It had taken his ability to leave. And in Shenandoah's mountains, on the trails where Jessica Winters once walked and then ceased to exist, the not deer still waits, patient and intelligent and hungry, maintaining its perfect imitation of an animal that doesn't quite understand its own nature, studying each human that enters its domain, learning their schedules and patterns and vulnerabilities, waiting for the moment when someone they love decides to hike a trail alone, waiting for the moment when it can add another person to the collection of the taken, the vanished, the forever missing who rest somewhere between the real world and the space where impossible things hunt.